How's that? You can see the presentation, right? Good, and we'll move somewhere where I can see you guys. Yeah, I think it's okay if you turn on your video. If everybody turns on their video, I think it's no problem. I don't think it'll crash the system. Zoom's pretty good. We've had a few hundred people on, so I don't think it'll be a problem with just a few of us. Good, okay, that's good. Right, so do we have horror fans in the audience? People who like horror movies? Exactly, me too. And here's some evidence for why it might be cool that we like horror movies. And then I'm gonna round it off by talking a little bit about some of the possible issues as well. So thanks for the introduction. Happy to be here. Thanks for the invite. It's always fun to talk about this stuff. This is one of my favorite topics to be talking about. I think it's kind of sexy that we're talking about horror movies, especially the benefit of horror movies. It's kind of niche. You know, I think for a long time we thought horror movies probably weren't very good for us. And that might be the case. I think context is king. So we're going to get around to that today. We've got a little bit of time. I'm really happy that we get a little bit of an elaborated time to talk together. Usually I've been giving kind of 20-minute talks recently, and I've got to cram everything into almost no space. So we've got a bit of extra space to hang together, which is nice. And there's not so many of us here. So I just want to encourage anybody to raise a hand if you want to just stop and talk in the interim anywhere along the way, and we can just see how long we get. And you know, and if it gets boring and you don't want to hear about this anymore, you want to hear about something else, you can just raise a hand and we can shift topic too. That's perfectly fine. So the work that I'm presenting today really started off as a collaboration with a couple of great people like Mark Anderson, who's at Aarhus University and a part of the Recreational Fear Lab. And that's Felix Scholler in the middle. He's affiliated with MIT Media Lab and a couple of other departments. And Julian Kiverstein, one of my regular colleagues who's at the Department of Psychiatry at Amsterdam University Medical Center. Right, so we started by kind of thinking about the paradox of horror, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, which is just sort of quickly that why is it that we enjoy and potentially even flourish when we periodically experience challenging emotions like disgust or fear or terror in response with engaging with lots of noxious stimuli, including horror stimuli. And the paradox is especially interesting for researchers like me because I'm interested in the predictive processing framework, which adds an extra layer of complexity here. So I guess lots of people here have already encountered the predictive processing framework, this computational neuroscience framework. Just give a show of hands if you know something about it or you've just heard of it. Yeah, exactly. And if you've never heard of it before, this is your kind of first encounter. Okay, well, I'll just say something quickly. So it's a new framework for thinking about cognition and increasingly consciousness, and it's being applied to a huge array of sort of topics today. In a quick nutshell, the framework basically suggests that the brain and the nervous system and maybe even the wider body, depending on who you're talking to, can be usefully characterized as a prediction engine. So that's an engine whose primary task it is to use what it learns about the statistical regularities of its environment. So the brain and the nervous system is always learning about how the environment unfolds. And then it uses that statistical knowledge to make better predictions about what will happen next. And then it works to reduce any discrepancies, or what we call errors, between the predictions that it makes and how the actual world is. And it does that either by updating its predictions to better fit the world or by acting in ways to make the world better fit the model. And it turns out, this is the kind of cool bit, is that it turns out that like making and updating and confirming predictions is a super efficient way to for self-organizing systems like us to learn a lot about their environment and to really remain well adapted. So we're building robots like this now. We're thinking about artificial intelligence in the same sort of way. Thinking about it as model creation and model updating is a super efficient way for a system to get a good grip over its environment. So the reason why the paradox of horror is especially interesting for somebody who thinks that the brain might be a prediction engine is that we have to basically ask, why is it that agents whose modus operandi then is to reduce uncertainty, to reduce error, why would we go out of our way to create a bunch of errors, to create a bunch of uncertainty, create a bunch of volatility? Because that's essentially what you're doing, right? And if you have any friends who are like outside of their window of tolerance and now they're doing like super bland vanilla activities and you're kind of like, you know, the new Saw movie comes out and you're there opening night, they might look at you and be like, what are you doing? Why would you go and provoke like moments of terror. Why would you do that? And like, if you're a predictive system and you're trying to reduce the error in your environment, trying to reduce the uncertainty, it's pretty weird that we consistently seem to go out of our way to create a bunch of uncertainty. So what does that mean? Is that then a knockdown claim? And is this a good argument against predictive processing? Could that be the case? Some people have suggested that. We don't think it is. But I just want to start a little bit with, just pointing out this tendency for pushing ourselves to extremes and outside of our predictable sets is just a fact of life for humans, right? We're always pushing ourselves out of our window of tolerance, outside of our window of predictability. We jump out of airplanes and we free climb, and we change our bodies in extreme ways. And it's totally not, outside of the realm of possibility that you have friends who would say they'd go to Mars as one of the first people to go to Mars, which is a super weird thing, right? Because Mars is like the extreme of uncertainty. It would be like nothing you've ever done before. And like, I mean, if I got you to raise hands for if you or somebody you know would probably like to go to Mars if there was a chance, we would not see a zero amount of hands. Some people are going to be like, yeah, we have a kind of adventurous spirit to go out into the unknown. So how do we reconcile this love of the unpredictable with our hard-coded drive to predict well? And the answer is, we think, to appreciate a somewhat updated view of what affectivity does in the predictive system. So what role emotion plays in the predictive system is going to be an important part of telling that story, right? And I don't have time today to get into all the specifics. And since you're not predictive processing researchers, they're probably not all that interesting. Anyway, you can check out our paper as well if you want to get into the nitty-gritty. But I do want to put a couple of moves from the framework on the table. And then I'm going to come back to horror movies once we're all cool with how the framework looks at these things. Is that okay so far? Yeah? Okay, great. So our very first attempts to think about interception, so think about feeling in predictive processing, it began in much the same way that we think about extraception or external perception. So that is, well, except for the signals that you're, so those are signals like from the gastrointestinal tract and urinary and reproductive tracts and circulatory system and respiratory system. And the feelings, right? So our hunger, our feelings of hunger and thirst and temperature and itch and pains, those are all now understood as top-down predictions about the hidden causes that are underlying those physiological changes in the first place. And then researchers in affective neuroscience, like people like Lisa Feldman Barrett, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. She's very popular today, an amazing researcher, and Mika Allen as well. They were pretty quick to add that interceptive predictions were potentially going to have a special place in the process. They weren't going to just be like other predictions per se. And they suggested that probably interceptive predictions were going to act as a kind of pacemaker, right, in the brain, grounding the other predictions in important ways in really what matters to us, which is really ultimately to maintain our physiological bounds, right, within those highly expected states that allow us to stay alive, for instance, like temperature, So the physiology, the predictions that govern physiology might sit at the center of the predictive regime and become a kind of gravitational force for how the other predictions are going to be created. So they already had a little bit of a special place. More recently, however, and this is the part that I think is most interesting, is that feelings are starting to look like they may play another role in the predictive system altogether. So this is the important part for my talk today to get clear on. It's what all of my research has been on for the last few years. So I just want to take you through it a little. First, we have to appreciate that in predictive processing, the reward story, like the neural reward story, is basically turned completely on its head. So rewards, according to this framework, are just highly expected states. Okay, so reward circuitry then, including all the dopaminergic systems, right? They help tune predictive animals to opportunities to reduce the error between those highly expected states and, like, for instance, the fish being in water and the currents in the animal's current state, for instance, the fish being in the air. Okay, so you might say the fish, it desires to be in the water, and so it gets rewarded the closer it gets to being back in the water now that it's outside of its environment. In predictive processing terms, we say it has a high expectation to be in water. Fish are always in water. They have a high probability of being in water, because if they didn't have a high probability of being in water, they would all have died, and then they would have no children, and then there would be no fish, right? So being in water is a highly expected state. And so as it moves from its non-expected state, like being in the air, to its highly expected state, being in the water, it's getting rewarded along the way. And what the reward signal is doing is tuning it to those opportunities that best get it back to the water. Okay, so that gives us a sort of novel way of thinking about positive and negative feelings that are associated with reward. Here, those good feelings, they mark a predictive progress towards states that we highly expect to be in. Okay, so a quick side note here, maybe, for any PP researchers that are in the audience. Notice then that feelings don't only occur as top-down predictions about the cause of bodily signals. That was the past story, right? They also emerge here as a form of second-order information about how well or poorly we're doing at predicting error over time. And that's a novel contribution to the literature. Okay, so over a number of papers, here's a few of them. We've been developing this idea in a more robust way. And the idea is basically that these affective changes, they provide valuable information for the system about how well it's predicting. So, and those feelings in turn help tune the system to select those actions that are most likely to be adaptive over time. Hesp and colleagues, if you wanted to get a little bit technical here, you don't have to worry about this too much today. You don't have to understand definitely the graph, but Hesp and colleagues have done a really good job of formalizing it. So their paper, Deeply Felt Affect, is where you want to go if you want to see the computational nitty-gritty of this idea. But just simply put, we feel good when we do better than expected at reducing prediction error, and we feel bad when we do worse than expected at reducing prediction error. And those feelings, they make us more or less confident in our models. And those models are then the way that we select our actions going forward. So the take-home message is that we literally feel our way to predictive optimization. That's the take-home message there. And it's important to note here that a system that's being tuned in this way will be always attracted to some degree to finding better than expected slopes of error reduction, right? So if it feels good to do better than expected, that's just another way of saying it feels good to improve. So predictive systems that are set up to tune in this way are always going to be attracted and driven and tuned to those opportunities that are better than expected, those opportunities to be improving your predictive grip, okay? So you might imagine that a system that's devoted to reducing error would love being in a dark, boring room. So here's the argument against predictive processing, right? So you think, well, if you want to reduce error, then what you want to do is you want to be in a room where there are no possibilities for error, right? So like, why is it that when we hear like, okay, so if I was hanging out with you right now and I said, look, I've got this great idea. I'm going to get a sensory deprivation chamber, okay? And then I'm just going to feed myself intravenously, and I'm going to find a way where I can like pass waste, and then I never have to leave. I'll just be in there, you know, and just have reruns of Friends on all the time or something. Why is it that we're not all going like, oh yeah, that sounds like such a good idea? I mean, if you're a graduate student or you're in your PhD, you probably are feeling like that when I say that, because if you're way outside of your window of tolerance, it can feel like, oh my God, that would be so great. There wouldn't be anything to do. I could just be in a cocoon. But for most of us, it doesn't feel good to be in a cocoon, right? And one of the reasons is why we can't be satisfied in a dark room for long. The answer to that puzzle, we think, is that it would quickly become too predictable. And so that it wouldn't give you these good slopes, these good opportunities for finding better than expected opportunities for reducing error, right? So just to note here also, like, this isn't just an ad hoc add-on for predictive systems like us. What matters here isn't that we reduce errors right now for these kinds of systems, but that we reduce errors over our lifetime, okay? That's also got to be taken into consideration. And it turns out that in our kind of volatile environment, being attracted to errors that we can learn from, you know, those places where we can best find those good error reducing slopes, that means that we're constantly growing our abilities to manage error in lots of kinds of niches. And it turns out that the best way to keep errors at a minimum over a lifetime is to keep getting better within your bandwidth of improving your error minimizing skills. You get that? Like if you grow up in a really isolated, sheltered, narrow, fragile kind of life, that might work as long as that niche persists. But, you know, like how many niches persist through our lifetime, really? Like not really, right? I mean, impermanence is kind of the game here. So it turns out that if impermanence is the game, the best kind of predictive system over the long run is going to be the one that explores and updates and changes and challenges themselves bit by bit as they go along. Okay, so how's that so far? Do we feel good so far? Was that too fast? We feel comfortable? We feel within our window of tolerance for the idea? Okay. So where do slope chasers like us find the best slopes? Too much error means that the environment is too volatile, and too meaning like our predictive system, our predictive models aren't good enough to be able to reap the error because it's too volatile. And too little errors means that there's no more interesting errors to learn from. So humans and other animals, in fact, prefer spaces and objects and opportunities that are just outside of their skill sets and abilities, right? And we see this everywhere. People, this like attraction to the edge of complexity. We see it in babies. Babies are attracted to medium complex things, not too simple, not too complex. If you put rats in a maze where you have increasingly complex rooms, they always hang out in the room just above the room that they're most familiar with. And we're building successful robots with those ideas too. And it's that middle place that we call consumable errors in our paper. That is errors that we are well prepared to engage with and that we're able to yield high learning rates from. And so they will be rewarding to us. Okay, and slope chasing tendencies like this are especially visible in how children play. We've got this paper right now. I'm actually now on this paper with Julian Kiverstein as well, and we just got accepted a couple of days ago. So you can look for that soon. It's in Psychological Review, and it's a fantastic paper. Mark Anderson has just done such great work, and it's been like a year of work for him, and it's a fantastic paper. So definitely check it out if you're interested in these topics. So in play, you know, humans and actually a bunch of other intelligent animals too, we will deliberately create consumable errors, okay? So we tie our legs together, we blindfold ourselves in order to create just the right amount of complexity. You know, now you know how to run. That's not fun anymore. So the best thing to do is tie your legs together. So you create a bunch of error, not too much error, but just the right amount of error that is consumable. And really, play is only enjoyable if you think about it, insofar as there are consumable prediction errors that we're engaging with. So there has to be some novelty, some violation of expectation in order to pique an organism's interest. So, you know, what starts off as fun in your living room eventually is kind of boring, and maybe you need to escalate up to find your new critical edge. Maybe not doing handstands on buildings, but there's the extreme. So now we're coming back into the cool stuff. Recreational fear is just such a cool example of how I think humans go about creating consumable prediction errors that are kind of scary fun to hang out with. In this case, they're doing that by playing in domains that we're typically hardwired to be adversive towards, right? So it's obvious that we find good slopes in scary spaces, isn't it? You know, kids kind of dig it when you chase them around being like a monster. If you have any like nephews or nieces or kids or brothers and sisters, you know, like kind of scaring the crap out of them makes them laugh like crazy, right? And they come back for more. They just love sort of that kind of style. Teenagers go through a period, I think every teenager go through this, where we are just super attracted to movies where aliens jump out of people's chests. You know, we love that. We love jump scare opportunities. And here's a great study. If you don't know it, definitely check it out again. This is Mark Anderson again. He and colleagues studied 110 participants in a horror house in Denmark that they regularly do these experiments in. And they watched, they put a heart monitor on people who went through this really terrifying haunted house attraction. And the haunted house is pretty brutal. So it's got live action people in it. So you can see that's a picture of the actual place. Like they've got a guy in a pig mask with a live chainsaw that chases you through a part of the park. It's pretty brutal, you know? And then as they exited the horror house, they asked them to complete a questionnaire, and then they checked the heart rates, and they asked them, did you enjoy it and what level of enjoyment did you have? And they found some pretty interesting things. They found exactly what we would sort of expect, which is that a moderate amount of fear, and a moderate amount of small scale heart rate fluctuation was linked to the most self-reported enjoyment. So there was kind of a U-shaped relationship here. Too boring, not fun. Too scary, not fun. The right amount of scary, super fun. Okay. Okay, so given all of that, how are we doing so far? Good? Any questions so far? I can't see everybody's face because I've only got a selection of windows, so I can see about 5 of you. Put up a digital hand, maybe if you've got a question along the way, and then I think you'll slot to the front of my window, or maybe one of the organizers can let me know. Are we good so far? Should we push through? Okay. All right, so now given everything we've said, we are predictive organisms. Predictive organisms actually are affectively tuned to find the edge of complexity, and that has all sorts of adaptive features. Turns out that actually as humans, we don't just wait around. We don't just wait around for those kinds of things. We make them all the time because we're kind of complex and cool like that. If we like consumable errors, we just go out and make a bunch of consumable errors, and then we eat them and we feel good. And it turns out that one of the ways that we can do that is we can start tapping into hard-coded anxieties and fear systems that we have related to horror. Okay, so given all of that, why do we love horror movies? So, right, so not only do we love these kinds of consumable errors, but we go out and we make these consumable errors. And that's exactly what I think we're doing with horror movies. And I think it's why we find them so attractive. First, film offers slope chasers like us some really cool opportunities. So just film overall. So here's a bit of the neuroaesthetics sleeping in. So given that we're attracted to a sweet spot of error minimization, it really shouldn't be surprising that we self-structure our own lives and we self-structure our culture in ways that produce and can deliver to us a kind of constant, steady stream of meaningful prediction errors that we can consume and digest and enjoy. Just think of roller coasters, right? Like roller coasters is a perfect example of this. You are literally setting up expectations. Oh, it's slow. It's slow. It's easy. It's fun. It's not fun. It's not easy. You're in danger. It's cool. Don't worry. Yeah, like we're literally setting up expectations and then breaking those expectations in sort of meaningful ways and then reestablishing those connections again. And films turn out to be a lot like roller coasters. I think that's a really nice parallel. In fact, they are built in exactly the same way. When we do that by structuring the kind of tempo and arcs in movies through things like narrative and even the use of cinematography. If you're a film student, then you know this. Post-editing is a big part of creating tempos and breaking tempos, creating those sort of temporarily frustrating moments, and then resolving those frustrating moments for the viewer so that you can produce these good slopes of error reduction passively for your spectators. And in fact, there's a whole kind of cottage science growing up around this fact today, where neuroscientists are starting to collaborate with filmmakers in some interesting ways to try to figure out what are the best ways to kind of create, sustain, and break slopes of error reduction in order to produce these really interesting effects in audiences. So Keith Bound at Receptive Media is a super good example of this, I think. He works as a consultant for filmmakers who, using neuroscience studies to help produce kind of interesting, attractive effects in a movie, including building and breaking suspense. So you can literally see this. This is from his website of the things that he's talking about. So he's watching how rhythms and emotion, suspense and engagement, how they work and what part of the movie does that. And then you can feed that back into the filmmaker who's now learning, oh, that really worked. That didn't work, it was too quick. That didn't work, it was too long. Oh, there's the sweet spot right there. Right, so then let's adjust that. Let's adjust the timing, let's adjust the tempo. It's pretty cool. I mean, a lot of that's been intuitive until now, but it's kind of cool that we can get a scientific measure for some of these. I might just say as a side note, since we've got a little bit of extra time here, that the fact that TV and film curate errors for us, you know, they're like curated error creation and resolution, because it's the director and the writer who are, and the producers who are making those slopes for us, just like they were building a roller coaster, is probably one of the reasons, and I'm just about to write a paper on this, is one of the reasons why we turn to TV for solace when we are experiencing anxiety or depression, right? So for whatever reason, we are failing to manage the volatility in our environment, probably especially social volatility. And what we have in television, especially well-known television, is kind of interesting, is we have a chance for errors to be created and resolved in a really safe and effective way. So I basically think that the stress of my PhD, which nearly killed me, I think probably that's every PhD's experience by the end, is why I know basically every line of all 10 seasons of Friends, you know, because some days your thesis just isn't working, you're not able to create those good slopes of error reduction, so you turn to something that's highly understandable, and you can just watch it create errors for you. Oh no, there's something going on with the characters. Oh, there, and it gets resolved. Right, 2, another reason why we might love horror movies, they potentially help tune our predictive model, our generative model, as we say in the field, to dangerous possibilities in the real world. So in addition to creating slopes through their structure, I think that specific films are also going to be sought out, you know, for instance, horror films are going to be sought out for their specific content related errors that they produce and resolve for us. So a super good example right now for us, of course, is that during the COVID-19 pandemic, I don't know if you knew this or not, but the market share on horror films tripled. So it went from 12% of total films to 43% of films being made, which is why when you look at Netflix right now, it's pretty dark. You know, you have to go down a couple of things before you're not seeing like pretty traumatizing shows. It tripled. That's where the big money is right now. And that's the largest share we've seen in modern history. Pretty interesting. So, and in particular, pandemic movies hit the charts. A sort of perfect example is Soderbergh's Contagion, which it topped the iTunes download charts for basically the entire pandemic. So that's weird, right? I mean, do we not, some of us think that's kind of a spooky thing that happened? Because you would think that a film about a global pandemic would not be the one we would select while we're in a global pandemic. I mean, you're having pandemic error related phenomena all day. And then you're like, oh, let's watch a movie tonight, honey. What do you want to watch? Oh, let's watch a disease that ravages the whole earth. Doesn't that sound like a super good time? And yet that's what we did. Just blatant evidence that that is in fact exactly what we did. So why is that? Super weird. One explanation that we think, although it might be a bit surprising, you know, we'd expect comedies to be very popular, but in fact they're not. And you would think that we'd want to avoid those volatile situations, but we don't. So why? What's the answer? Well, we kind of dig what the New York Times journalist Wesley Morris wrote. So I'm just going to read what he said. So he said this at the beginning of the pandemic about Contagion in particular. So he said, the movie hit me squarely in the entertainment cortex. I love that. That's like exactly what we think is going on, right? This funny, scary, stylish, soapy, plausible speculation of life during a global outbreak. The appeal now is how it's proving to be an instructive worst case scenario for our current freakout. We've turned to it in part to really get a grip on how bad things could go. Okay, so horror films and other works of fiction, we think this is a fruitful direction to be going. We think that they can be thought of as opportunities for exploring and learning about counterfactual events, as opportunities to find new ways of reducing prediction error well in our environment. So according to predictive processing, we select actions based on predictions about the amount of error that an action will reduce over the long term. So you always have multiple action possibilities in play. And the one that you calculate will be the one to reduce the most amount of error relative to your cares and concerns, your highly expected states. That's the one we pick. And we succeed at that insofar as we're able to consider counterfactual possibilities and are actually able to select the best candidate. Okay, so that's one of the reasons. So the better the model we have of how things evolve over time, the better we are at selecting the right behaviors in the present moment that are going to lead to those good expected outcomes. So that's one of the reasons why we are constantly ruminating, on past events, and why we might be time traveling and mind wandering to future possibilities. We are, in effect, in part, imaginatively exploring scenarios, foraging for little insights about how the world works and how errors unfold, and figuring out how best to manage those prediction errors. So stories and movies are useful, we think, in exactly the same sort of way. They offer us the opportunity to do kind of externally what we're doing internally all the time, right? They help us can help us refine our prediction models. They introduce scenarios, and more importantly, they introduce agents who are responding to those scenarios. And we, as good Bayesian learners, as good predictive processing agents, we are guessing what will happen next, and we're updating our model relative to perceived outcomes. So horror can be enjoyable in part, I think, because it's providing us an opportunity to sort of play around in an offline mode, in an offline sort of imaginative mode with what scares us or disgusts us. And so allows us to bring down prediction errors by playing out possible scenarios and helping us tune our generative model to the kinds of possible outcomes that can come. Okay, so one, film itself creates slopes. It's one of the things that good films do. Two, the content of films are also beneficial for predictive systems like us in order to update our generative models so that we're better able to pick good actions in the present moment. And we get rewarded by improving our grip, or by improving our predictive models of the world. So of course, we're going to go forage for information. And in our media-soaked world, one of the ways that we do that is we turn to media. And finally, three, horror films allow us, this is the coolest one, I think, and the most important one for me, they allow us to learn about and so optimize our own affective responses. This is another place where I think horror films are updating us as a predictive model. So one important thing that we're learning when we're engaging with horrifying stimuli is we're learning about our own horrified responses, right? We're learning about our own fear responses. We're learning about our own emotional reactions. And we don't have time to go into too much today, although, we can bring it up if you guys want to talk about it afterwards. But I want to at least suggest a possible way to think about this. So exposing ourselves in safe situations to our own affective responses to changes in the rate of error reduction allows the system to better predict and so further optimize how those changes occur and what sorts of behaviors they engender. So if you want to get into the nitty gritty, this is a really nice paper by Lars Sandved-Smith and colleagues where they're starting to talk about some of the ways, some of the deeper layers of this model where we can start making models of our models of our models. We don't need to get too much into it today. I'll just give you a quick example here. Through repeated experience of anxiety, for example, so that the uncomfortable valence of the arousal. So what do we learn when we repeatedly experience anxiety? One thing that we learn by repeatedly experiencing anxiety is that the uncomfortable valence and arousal is finite, right? So you can see here on this graph, like anxiety never skyrockets and stays up. The emotional system isn't really built like that. arousal systems always go up and then they descend. That's not immediately obvious to us though, unless we've had lots of experiences like that. If you've ever been out and you drank too much or you had food poisoning and you were sick the next day, it can feel like you are now going to be sick to your stomach forever. You know, I don't know if you've had that experience, but I think I definitely have, where I'm like, now this is the state. This is the sort of state of affairs. I'm now going to be sick indefinitely. And that's the part that's really upsetting to me, is that I don't know how long I'm going to be sick. Same thing with being in turbulence. Like I'm not a very good flyer right now. And I love pilots who, when we hit turbulence, just say, look, it's going to be 10 minutes. Then I can like set my watch and I know exactly the arc that my arousal system is going to take. And just improving my prediction of that arc already helps me reduce my anxiety. Like another good example is actually giving a talk, right? Every time I go to give a talk, I have a certain amount of anxiety. I think everybody here can probably sympathize with that. But I've given so many talks now that I don't really notice it at all, those little bits of butterflies or whatever. And the fact that I can predict, my system now predicts well the kind of rise and fall in my own anxiety when I give a talk, I barely notice it. And so that really frees me up to make good behaviors, like coming online rather than calling in sick or something, you know? But if those errors, if those same anxiety errors were to persist for a long time, like for multiple days, then of course I would start to notice again that something was going wrong in the system. Then maybe I'd like to talk to a doctor or something. So often what matters here isn't the momentary rise and fall in error per se. Remember that there's always going to be some error in the system. There's always going to be some sort of volatility that we're working with, but it's not all going to be newsworthy, okay? Rather, what tends to matter most is changes in how we expect those errors to change over time. So changes in that slope of error. So the fact is that to make better predictions about our responses, we have to have those responses, okay? I think that's a great take-home message here. If we're gonna get better at responding, then we actually have to have those responses. And I think that's what controlled scares can do for us. The better that we can model how error rises and falls when we're scared, the better we can predict and the better we can optimize our own responses in those similar circumstances in the future. And I think that aligns super well with things that we're already seeing in the horror realm. So a couple of good examples there. A good 2018 experiment here found that horror fans enjoy being scared because it helps them gain a sense of mastery or a sense of control over their fears. Maggie Kerr's book is extremely good, I think. In it, she talks a lot about how exposure to fun, scary stimuli could help make other stressful environments more tolerable, in part because you're learning about your own stress reaction. And this is my favorite one. This is Coltan Scrivener. If you don't know Coltan yet and you're interested in these topics, you definitely want to encounter his research as soon as possible. He and some colleagues did a really nice experiment that showed that watching horror movies can have a lot of different positive effects in how we cope in anxiety-ridden environments. So the study looked at more than 300 people, and it showed that horror fans in particular were faring much better psychologically than non-fans during COVID, which I think is such a cool outcome. So that suggests, and they write, I'll just read the quote, it may be people learn about their own fear responses and about regulating their own emotions through watching horror movies, and then they were better prepared to do so when they were put under duress. And we think that's probably right as well. Good. Okay, I just want to stop there for a second and see if we have any questions. That's 40 minutes in. I have a little bit more time in my talk window, right? Yeah, okay, good. Anybody have any questions here? Otherwise, what I want to do is, so I've set up 3 reasons why we think horror can be beneficial and why it's kind of interesting for us and why we would be attracted to it, why we think it's shiny. And just to round this out, I want to talk a little bit about some of the harmful impacts that horror can have, because what I don't want to do here is just kind of bang the drum for getting in front of horror movies as soon as possible. I find I do the same thing in mindfulness communities. everybody's saying, oh, mindfulness is super healthy, but actually it's always a bell curve, and it's always context is king. Mindfulness is super healthy if you're the kind of person, especially who avoids things. But if you're the kind of person who ruminates and obsesses about things, then actually it can be counter helpful. Oh, did we just get a chat? Did somebody put something in the chat that's worthy? Actually, put up a hand if you want to ask me anything here. Otherwise, we'll keep going, and then we can talk afterwards. Oh, nice. Yeah.
So far, I just want to say this is an amazing talk. I'm really into it.
Thanks.
And this might actually be something to cover in the next section.
Please.
So I was debating about waiting, but I figured it might be good to ask. So
Yeah.
I'm thinking about sort of how horror can be beneficial in sort of modeling, or not modeling, but predicting our cognitive responses or affective responses towards actual world stimuli, specifically the last point you made. And sort of we can refine our affective attitudes and refine our affective responses, or at least get better at predicting them. I was wondering if there might be a worry, though, that goes along with that benefit of we might become overconfident in how we will react or how we ought to regulate our emotional responses when we're in analogous scenarios presented in the horror movie. I might think that because I've seen Halloween so many times that if someone breaks into my house and does all these terrible things, I'm going to react this way, or I ought to react this way. Yeah. But in reality, I kind of have overplaced my confidence in how I've reacted to the horror film, and I end up reacting completely differently in that scenario as a result. And I should have done other things to refine my own emotion. Just wondering what you thought about that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It's a super good point. I don't know what I have to say about that. Right. So we could create overly confident bad models using movies. I think we do that. Think about dating. I don't think movies tell us anything good about how to have a date. Not really, because they're totally contrived. I was sitting in a park one day in Toronto, and I saw a romance scene being shot between Drew Barrymore and one of her co-stars in the park. I can't remember who now. And it was the moment where they kissed. I really think that's what it was. I was a little bit of a distance, so I couldn't hear what they were saying, but it really looked like the first kiss moment. Okay. And it was like people were like in the background throwing fall leaves at them to make just the right kind of kind of sexy flow of leaves. And they must have did that 25 times to get it right. And so if you watch that and you go, oh, that's how it is to have a first kiss, you're screwed, I suspect, because that's not at all what it's like for humans to have a first kiss or what it's like to date somebody. So I think that's a real concern, that we are looking to build models. Maybe we don't know where to look well to build models. And then we're putting overconfidence in bad sort of model generation. I mean, the Mindy Project is kind of like that. If you've ever seen the Mindy Project, she just loves romance movies, but then she's terrible at romance, right? Because she tries to use these models in real world scenarios, and they just don't work in real world scenarios. So I don't know what I want to say other than I think you've put your finger on like one of the ways that predictive systems get confused by the kinds of medias that we have available to us. And I really am interested in that. Especially today, like we have some nice popular articles out right now. And actually Ben White, who's here with me tonight, we have an article that just dropped on how social media warps the generative model in all sorts of pathological, non-adaptive ways, right? So you use filters and you set up scenes and it's completely fake. And yet we're building these models about what life should look like based on the best possible storefront of people's lives. And then we're having critical depression grow out of our FOMO from persistent volatility because our life isn't like theirs. And meanwhile, nobody's life is like theirs. Even their life isn't like theirs. Like I love these, short little memes that we're starting to get, of people where they all smile for a picture. And then as soon as it drops, somebody's filming them from a distance. Then you see them like immediately go back to like a super hostile body manner with one another. You can tell they're fighting. And then, their girlfriend or boyfriend is like, hey, picture. And then they're like, and then right away they're fighting again. It's totally unrealistic. So anyway, I think it's a ripe field for investigation about all the ways that we're being tricked, if that's any use for you in response to your question.
It is, thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, great. And we have one more hand too. Still around?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The question I'm looking at is science fiction versus horror.
Right.
And how do you see how do you look at it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, again, I think this is a super ripe field for investigation, thinking about the ways that fiction interplays with our kind of predictive systems. I'm not exactly sure. I think it's probably a big field. I think probably we're attracted to science fiction for all sorts of, probably for lots of different reasons. I guess the one thing is that regardless of the situation, like no matter how fantastical it is, there's sort of like different beings relating to each other in different ways. I don't know if we're attracted to science fiction because we think, we're really going to end up meeting aliens one day. I mean, maybe that's a small percentage of why we're attracted to science fiction. I'm actually not really sure. Do you have any intuitions about why we might be attracted to science fiction given the sort of framework?
As a doctor of philosophy, I look at it from a standpoint of maybe what we want to have happen versus what we don't want to happen. Okay. Right. So you take one side of it, and then the other side of it. But what I was thinking from your perspectives, there is some good horror in science fiction, like The Alien, for instance.
Yeah.
Was very good. And some of the other ones that come out. But, to put it together, to try to make it make sense.
Yeah, I really hear that. Yeah, I guess like intuitively, if I think about my own, because I'm a big science fiction nerd, I think science fiction is one of these opportunities to play safely with all sorts of ideas. You can just play around. I mean, it's not your world. It's not happening here. So maybe that creates a little bit of distance for some of the topics that are challenging for us to think about. Also, it really lets us like bend our generative model in all sorts of really weird and wild ways. Like Heinlein's book, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. You get to think about like what all sorts of different family dynamics might be, or what it might be like to live in a very different environment. Yeah, I'm not really sure. Yeah, but if you have anything more to say about it in the future, I'd love an email because I am interested in it, but I haven't thought about it much. Okay.
Mark, there was one more question in the chat. What filmmakers are working with researchers? If you have
I don't know, actually. It would be worth looking up. I don't really have a list, but if you build one, I'd love to get an email. Yeah. I mean, if you go to the researcher that I pointed out, we can go back there at the end of the talk. On their website, he has listed a bunch of people that he's working with, but I can't really remember right now any of the directors. Okay. All right. So in the final part of this talk, I'd like to raise a few interesting future directions for research that I'm interested in particular, working to fill out a little bit some of the reasons that a predictive system might be attracted to horror in ways that turn out not to be beneficial and could potentially even be harmful for a kind of predictive system. Like I don't want to get too like, it can look pretty sexy. This horror is good for you, because it's pretty provocative. I mean, I think that's why it catches headlines because it's kind of counterculture in a way. But I do think that there's lots of reason to be careful with the kinds of media that we're consuming. And I just want to talk a little bit about that. So first, I found it pretty surprising to learn that lots of horror fans struggle with anxiety. And in fact, many say that horror helps their anxiety. In addition to lots of anecdotal evidence, there is some good new research that's aimed at how horror might help people control their feelings of anxiety. Here are a couple of good examples. So given our discussion so far, it does make some sense. Morbid curiosity, so curiosity in morbid things, which is a whole field. If you're interested in that, it's a pretty cool field. Can be, although it doesn't have to be, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. Morbid curiosity can be a kind of information seeking, right? You're attempting to get a good or better predictive grip on a volatile situation by actively seeking out and digesting anxiety-riddled environments, right? So, you might rubberneck car accidents because something in you is trying to get some more information about how that happened so that you can be a better driver. I think if we have somebody pass in our lives or in our sphere, one of the first things we feel very urgently to find out, although it's socially sometimes unacceptable to ask, is like, what actually happened? Like, I need as much detail as possible. I know when I read an obituary, sometimes I feel like I wish they would say in detail exactly how that happened. Not because I'm super interested, but because something in me is trying to learn in some way, like, how do people my age, how are they getting into trouble in the world? But I think there's at least two other reasons that anxious people might be attracted to horror films, and that these may not be as beneficial as sort of information-seeking opportunities. So first, I just want to say a little bit what anxiety is in predictive processing terms, because I'm trying to build this out of first principles. So this is a bit of a longer story than we have time for today, but just in broad strokes. So when a predictive agent encounters an overly volatile niche, okay, so that's an environment where they persistently fail to get a good predictive grip. There's persistent error or rising error that they're not able to consume and they're not able to task switch away from. They can, in time, begin to predict that those levels of volatility are natural. So they start installing high-level predictions about the environment being too much volatility. And that's a sort of nasty point, because if they start to predict that the world is volatile, then they'll start to try to confirm those predictions. They'll start trying to find opportunities to confirm their prediction that the world is actually a pretty volatile place, even if the environment changes. And that's what we think pathology is you build a model and then it becomes rigid. And then even when you change an environment, it stays rigid. And so it causes problems. So one fallout of this expectation, this high-level expectation about volatility, is a persistently high level of prediction error, prediction about the need for metabolic energy. So one issue here about now expecting that things are going to be really volatile is that you're going to constantly be thinking that you need a lot of metabolism in order to deal with the challenges that are in the world. And of course, we have limited metabolic stores, right? So the constant expectation to be on high alert because you're expecting the world to be super challenging, it leads to all the kinds of dysregulations and disruptions that we see accompanying anxiety and depression. So, disruptions in the HPA axis and pathological cortisol levels and disruptions in immune function and sort of all the rest. Lisa Feldman Barrett's paper on the active inference theory of allostasis, interception, and depression is extremely good for laying those out. So that in turn creates a new layer of persistent errors in the body, right? Because now the body is being dysregulated. And that results, so you're following me? So that results in turn with those interceptive signals being really noisy in the predictive system. Okay, so there's a low signal to noise ratio now. So the body isn't working the way it's supposed to do. So it's sending up lots of errors. It's now the body starts to feel uncertain as well. So not only is the environment uncertain, but now the body is starting to kick off lots of uncertainty. And in order to deal with that noisy environment, this is so interesting, this new research, a predictive processing system may just reduce the precision. It may just turn the volume down on those units in the body. Okay, so one of the ways that you can deal with the error from the body, if it's persistent, is you can just turn the volume down on the amount of signals that are coming up into the actual system from the body. So the system is still super worked up. You just turn the volume down on it so it doesn't impact the system in the same sort of ways. Okay, so that means that prediction errors that are produced by your autonomic, endocrine, and immune changes in response to your anxiety are going to be increasingly ignored. Volume's going to get shut down, which leads to further accumulation of the problem because you're not dealing with the problem, you're just turning the volume down on the problem. And then that gets worse, which means you get more noise, which means you start losing interceptive clarity even further. So we find that just one more thing, a noisy interceptive system like that is actually really dangerous for our homeostatic control because it leads to sort of misinterpretations of what we need or what kind of environment we're in, okay? And so that loss of interceptive accuracy, sometimes also described as emotional clarity, we're now losing that because we're having pathological anxiety over a long time. That's why widely acknowledged as one of the core features in anxiety disorders. And it relates to a lot of other psychopathologies as well, like depression. And PP has given a really nice computational account of sort of how that all unfolds. And we won't talk about it today, but if you want to look it up, then PP is doing some really interesting work there. Okay, so that means people who struggle with anxiety they're going to tend to have a noisy and uncertain body knowledge. And the noisier that is, the more they're ignoring their body, and the more they ignore their body, the more the system is going to be dysregulated. So I just want to set the scene here for why horror might also be helpful in a sort of middle way. So we have sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly. So this is the sort of middle one for why it might be valuable. So why might horror help people with anxiety who have low emotional clarity? They have low emotional clarity because the anxious system over time turns the volume down. Why could horror help? One thing we propose is that horror films here might provide viewers with a super clear interceptive signal. Yeah, one that can really cut through the noise. Yeah, cut through the noise and help reestablish some predictive grip over your own body. And so create temporarily a certain amount of relief. Laura Barca and Giovanni Pizzullo are the people you want to look to if you want to see some evidence for this. They've suggested something similar about anorexia, and a disorder that they propose can occur in part to deal with a noisy interceptive system. So you have long-term anxiety, you get lots of noise in the system. They think anorexia can grow out of that kind of environment. So in this excellent paper, they propose that the amplified interceptive signal that comes when we restrict food, yeah, so the feelings of hunger, like intense feelings of hunger, they help reduce excessive uncertainty or the noisiness of the interceptive system by producing a strong, well-defined, well-predicted error signal that's, like I said, predicted and controllable. So you can imagine you have long-term anxiety, you're starting to lose contact with the body. The degree to which you lose contact with the body, the more uncertainty there is in the system. So the system is trying to find a way to reconnect with the body. So actually one of the ways you can do that is to create really controlled, really powerful interceptive signals. And one of the ways you can do that to regain control is you can create a really strong interceptive signal like hunger. So they argue that the strong signal of this kind can actually increase one's ability to begin creating better, more accurate models of the body again. That feels good, feels rewarding, insofar as that amplification of those interceptive errors related to the food restriction, that they temporarily reduce this general persistent background noisiness or uncertainty. Now, of course, you're going to see in their paper, and I think we all just know that this isn't going to be the best situation, right? I mean, that can't be the only way that we recreate a body map. It's one of the ways that we might automatically do that, but it might not be, of course, the healthiest way we do that. And I'll just come back to that in a second, but I want to make the point here about horror now. So Colton Scrivener, and this is the paper where he does that, and I agree. So we're beginning to work through some of these ideas together. And he actually has in his paper right now, some of these same ideas about horror helping to cut through uncertainty for about emotional states. Colton writes there, and I think he says it well, so I'm just gonna read you the quote. He writes, horror content may provide clarity for people who subsequently worry by offering an easily identifiable source of negative emotions. So he doesn't go into the computational story or talking much about the cognitive mechanisms that are responsible for that, but our most recent work is starting to look at how we can use predictive processing to fill out that story a little more. But I think Colton's work here helps us fill out why horror in particular might be useful. So while horror is designed to be surprising, it's surprising in a super predictable way, quite predictable way. We use music, and scare tropes and common narratives to create a sense of certain uncertainty, right? Like, when the character goes to the basement and the music goes up, you're now set in a situation for the uncertain thing to take place. So you are certain about the kind of uncertainty that's about to come. You know you're going to be scared, and you have good predictions about maybe when you're going to be scared, and you have some ideas. You know, you actually choose the theater you're going to be in. There's lots of things you control, even though you're creating an uncertain environment, uncertain signals. This is actually an ideal, is this an ideal solution for people with anxiety? Of course, in anorexia, the answer is no. You know, because all sorts of pathological outcomes flow from that kind of attempt for adaptivity. The local benefits of food restriction, I don't think outweigh, I think we agree, don't outweigh the tremendous dangers of creating habits around starvation. And unfortunately, the local successes are often traded off for more global concerns. Same thing we see in addiction, right? Locally satisfies a particular craving. Globally, we get into a much more challenging situation. So what about horror movies? You know, is it worth it? So before we end today, I just want to say a little about the possible suboptimal trap here that I think horror movies could produce. So far, I've been focusing on how predictive agents are attracted to better than expected opportunities for error reduction. And that's what we think underlies curiosity. But actually, that's only part of the story about what we find salient, because salience is a complex issue, right? So predictive agents are also attracted to signals and will go out of their way in order to create those signals that confirm their hypotheses, okay, about the world and about themselves. So expecting that your partner is in a bad mood will mean, unfortunately, that you are attracted to amplify those signals that confirm your prediction that they're in a bad mood. And of course, when you turn the volume up on their bad mood related stimuli, and then you start acting in ways that reflect that bad mood, and they notice that, then of course they might turn their volume up on your judgment features, which makes you think that they're in a bad mood, which upregulates the judgment features. And we get stuck in these little bad bootstraps, which is why human relationships are super hard, you know, because you have two predictive systems working over noisy information, using their biases in order to try to communicate with one another, which is a whole other topic. Right. So predictive agents, yeah. So that being said, so morbid curiosity is not always about being curious. So this is a sort of take-home point I'd like to make as well here. Our attraction to horror stimuli can also be about shoring up our models that we already have about how the world works or how we should feel. Now, here's the tricky part. I think you probably already sort of get a sense, right? Susan Oosterwijk makes this point in her paper very well. She writes that in relationship to morbid curiosity, and again, I'll just read the quote. She writes, increased viewing time for negative images does not necessarily indicate interest or curiosity. It may also reflect a state of general attentional vigilance or a state of anxiety, right? So again, here, predictive processing gives a nice computational story for why that might be the case. As I've already briefly mentioned, various psychopathologies are typified in predictive processing by this kind of nasty feedback loop where the system begins to expect the problem, right? You have high volatility, you now predict high volatility, now you start confirming high volatility, so that even when you get into a low volatility environment, you're still turning the volume up on high volatility and you're turning the volume down on low volatility data. It's nasty. So one of the fallouts of that sort of high level pessimistic prediction is that we sample the world and we actually create the kind of world that we're expecting to be in. So with that in mind, horror content of all kinds, I think, may also be sought out, not as a form of curiosity, but as a way to confirm our suboptimal beliefs about the world and the sorts of dangers that we expect to be in the world. So for examples, and this is a topic I'm extremely interested in, soldiers who are returning home from war with PTSD, they are often overly attracted to violent material. And that in turn can help maintain their expectations about being in danger. And I think that makes a lot of sense, right? You go somewhere super volatile, you have to become the kind of model that fits that adaptivity. You come home, now there's less volatility, but you expect a certain amount of volatility. And so you start structuring your world in order to get back to your expected volatility. right? So consuming that material then is rewarding for that kind of a predictive agent. And so it feels good because it's allowing them to close the gap between their expectations, for instance, the world being a dangerous place, and the actual world that they live in now, which might be relatively safe. So notice there that just because we're aiming at optimization as we're aiming at optimizing our predictions, that doesn't mean that we're going to automatically tend towards health or to the best possible model, right? It has everything to do with how the model is structured. So whatever collection of belief we have about how the world works, and we've touched on it a few times now, but that model can be bent in all sorts of ways that end up not being very helpful. So attraction to horror content, I think, including horror movies, may not produce the potentially beneficial effects related to curiosity that we've been talking about, things like increased flexibility and growth and learning. But rather, it might be sought out as a way for suboptimal beliefs to be further embedded, to be further empowered, to be further rigidified. And again, that is going to eventually lead to more suboptimal outcomes. So the worry is already part of the literature. This isn't sort of a new step here. I'm just bringing it into this literature. We're already starting to see it in sort of exposure therapy, literature on exposure therapy. So we know that exposure therapy is, everybody knows what exposure therapy is, where I think it's probably self-explanatory. You expose people to stimuli that they freak about, and then they get better at dealing with it because they have little bits of inoculation against it, okay? And we know now that exposure therapy is mostly helpful for people who tend to avoid their problems. So avoidance is a strategy that leads to greater pathology. If somebody tends to avoid, you get them to look little bit by little bit, you can overcome those pathological suboptimal adaptive strategies, right? So you're giving them a safe place to work through some of their fears. You're giving them an opportunity to engage with the scary thing in a place where they feel comfortable. And so they're learning about the thing and they're learning about themselves. And I hope you hear that that's exactly what horror movies can be doing for a certain kind of person. But for people who are obsessively attracted to fearful stimuli, who are always on the lookout to get more fear into the system, then that same therapy actually becomes harmful. Because what you're doing then is you're saying, well, here's more fodder for your pathological attraction to volatile stimuli. Right. So fear goes down for one people, but for other people, fear is on the upswing. And so I just hope to show that, like, in addition to just being an opportunity to get on good slopes and to learn about ourselves, there are these two other sort of middling reasons why horror might be interesting to us and might be, well, one might be beneficial, one might be not beneficial. One is we lose emotional clarity when we have long-term anxiety. It's one of the side effects. And horror might create the kind of punch-through effects that we can use. Now, whether that's the best way to be regaining a body model, I think we should be very suspicious of. It might be something that we default are attracted to if we don't think about it much. Same sort of thing with anorexia. It might just not be the best way to break through that noisiness to rebuild a body model. And there is this potential for fueling greater suboptimal models of the world. If you're already highly expecting volatility, and now you're going out and reconfirming your belief structure by getting that kind of information, then again, all you're doing is you're further embedding and further instantiating a kind of suboptimal belief set. And of course, that over the long term isn't going to help you. It's a little bit like flat earthers who only go on flat earth boards so that they can insulate their pathological belief, which of course leads to all sorts of suboptimal outcomes when you try to engage with normal, rational society. And I think that's probably enough for today. Yeah, that's a little bit cut off, but you can see it. So this is my website. I keep a really healthy, updated, fun website filled with stuff and links and podcasts and videos and all the rest. So if you're interested in any of this stuff, definitely check it out. That's my email. Now that we've spoken together, contact me anytime you want. Like, I love collaboration. I'm super happy to talk one-on-one about this stuff. And if anybody's working on these things, I am always looking to work with people and collaborate. And that's my Twitter that I only use for academic reasons. So if you want to jump on and see what we're on about, or then you can find me there. And thanks so much.